Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on the most pressing issues impacting transatlantic relations today. My name is Jörn Fleck. I'm the Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, and it is my pleasure today to welcome Roderick Kefferpütz, non-resident Senior Fellow with the Europe Center, but also in his main job, the Director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation European Union office in Brussels. Roderick, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Jörn. It's great to be here.
So today's conversation revolves around the June 26th European Council meeting of EU 27 heads of state, heads of government that just wrapped up in Brussels. And this EUCO summit focused on the many geopolitical challenges on the agenda for the European Union. Russia's continued war against Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, European defense and security cooperation, the competitiveness agenda, migration, and EU enlargement/accession. And at the same time, of course, as Europe continues to negotiate with the U.S. administration on tariffs, leaders also met to discuss the way forward for transatlantic economic relations. There's a lot to cover, Roderick, so I want to jump right in, and perhaps at the very top, you can just give us a sense of what are your main takeaways from this EUCO, this European Council meeting that just wrapped up.
Well, I think, first of all, it's like you said, they had a packed agenda at this EUCO meeting. It's also been a packed week. We had the EU-Canada summit in the beginning. Then during the middle of the week, we had the NATO summit. We had the whole situation in the Middle East with Iran. And I think one of the takeaways is that Europe really has to grow up in this world. And that conclusions, communiques alone are not going to be enough. It really has to invest in its own capacity and capabilities to act. And that's going to be one of the challenges.
So grow up and deliver. That's, I think, a good takeaway from the summit. Roderick, one of those areas that's really critical, essential, or existential, some would say, to Europe's future and its agenda, cutting across all those issues, is Russia's continued aggression against Ukraine and what that means for the future of Europe and European security. There was quite a lot on the agenda for the EU on all things related to Ukraine. There was the extension of the existing sanctions that went through. There was also hope and a promise, really, to start the negotiations in some chapters with Ukraine. That didn't happen. And there was also, obviously, on the agenda, an 18th package of EU sanctions that also didn't pass against the opposition, or due to the opposition from especially Slovakia in this case. So a really mixed bag for Ukraine. Or do you see any wins for President Zelensky and Ukraine?
Well, it's like you said, it's a mixed bag, but I think there are a couple of wins that you could see in this meeting. I mean, first of all, Zelensky was present at the NATO summit. There was a sit down with Trump. That was good. Then Zelensky was there digitally at the European Council summit. And again, they had council conclusions on Ukraine without Hungary, but 26 member states agreed to these council conclusions. And within those council conclusions, they say we will provide 30 billion of financial support for Ukraine in 2025. So I think that's a win. There was also, again, a clear roadmap lined out for Ukraine's accession, or a lot of support for the EU accession of Ukraine. They said they want to open up the fundamental chapter. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done in that extent, and particularly with Hungary threatening to block the accession or the movement towards opening up more chapters. That's a problem. It's good that there's the extension of the sanctions, but as you mentioned, the 18th package, that's a difficulty as well. So I think all in all, it's a mixed picture. We got some wins, but there is definitely a lot more to be done when it comes to Ukraine.
You already mentioned that the EUCO, the European Council meeting, followed immediately after the NATO summit in The Hague earlier this week. There, the alliance committed to 5% defense spending, 3.5 on hard defense issues, 1.5 on infrastructure-related and cyber-related issues that are linked to Europe's and transatlantic defense. The European Union over the last few months has made major announcements and spelled out aspirations in white papers and other announcements around EU defense and defense industrial cooperation, especially to the tune of 800 billion euros in total, potentially over the coming years. This was an agenda item as well for this European Council. Do we see any urgency, any progress here to really see changes and, as you put it, delivery on those ambitions and aspirations spelled out over the last few months?
Jörn, I think it's still a little bit too early to tell. It's as I mentioned in the beginning, we need to move from conclusions and communiques to actual capabilities. And one of the issues that we simply have on the table is that a lot of the EU member states have budget difficulties. I mean, just look at Spain. One of the reasons that they wanted to have this exception at the NATO summit was because they got budget difficulties, and the government is also just barely holding on by a thread. In France, the amount of money that they have to put alone into servicing their interest, that represents 12% of their budget of last year. And that's where the problem is. We got great words in the council conclusions. We got a lot of packages, the SAFE instrument, the EDIP instrument, EDIS, and all the other instruments that are there. But we have to start moving from announcements to actually starting to spend that money and starting to spend it in an efficient way where we really build up those capabilities. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to move forward to is really having a European financial instrument, such as Eurobonds, to make this more attractive. Because even the SAFE instrument that we have right now, the Security Action for Europe, is limited in its usefulness for the EU member states. So it's time to move forward on this.
Can I follow up with a quick question there? You outlined the financial challenges of actually moving to action on European security and defense industrial action. But wouldn't empty coffers, limited financial and fiscal space, wouldn't that actually act to force some action in terms of greater cooperation, greater defense industrial cooperation and integration? And where are the roadblocks here on really moving to the action part?
Well, we have always had a number of EU member states that have been kind of pushing back against more spending, right? And more common debt on the European level, particularly the Nordic countries. But some of these Nordic countries have switched sides over the last couple of months and years. Look at Denmark. The leader of Denmark has actually said that they want to move away from their fiscal hawkishness position because the security of Europe is at stake here. And that's something where, you can't weigh that up necessarily in terms of budgets. So we have to move forward. And I would argue this is also an opportunity for the euro as a global currency in the world. I mean, Christine Lagarde has said this is the euro moment. And so if we were to really create a kind of deep, liquid European debt market, that would be attractive for international investors. And we already see an increasing interest of investors for the European market. The Blackstone Group said they want to invest 500 billion over the next decade in Europe. A lot of US institutional investors are pouring more money into European ETFs. So I think there really is an opportunity here for Europe to deal with this urgency of investing in the defense industry and in security, and at the same time use this moment to place the euro more as a stronger global currency in the world.
Shifting to another whole set of issues, really, that also should require some urgency and action is the economic policy side of things. Internally, there's been a lot of talk and really the economic outlook and economic agenda, single market integration, capital markets union, and more broadly, the competitiveness agenda in the wake of the Draghi report, but also the whole political transition of last year remains at the top of the economic agenda for the European Union. We've seen sort of the start of a simplification agenda, and that's certainly been expedited or the importance has been elevated by the global uncertainty and the outlook there, and especially the Trump administration's tariffs. So competitiveness agenda at home and a very difficult trade policy agenda abroad, with the negotiations with the United States ongoing ahead of the July 9th deadline for the suspension of the Liberation Day tariffs of President Trump. On both of these items, what did the Council and the discussions of the leaders produce on competitiveness at home and how the EU approaches the trade negotiations with the Trump administration abroad?
Well, I think if you look at the competitiveness at home agenda and you look at the text that has been agreed, it's a lot of recalls, reconfirms, reminds the Commission. So it's a lot of items that we've been discussing for years and years and years and years and years. Completion of the capital markets union, energy union, put a new date on it. We have to complete it before the 2030s or before 2030. And this is where Europe can really get a lot of scale if it really manages to finally deepen and complete the single market. They particularly also mentioned the issues of startups and scaling up startups, because, this is one of the big issues in Europe. If you're a startup in Austria and you only get the Austrian market, that's a problem. You want to immediately get the 450 million people living in the EU as a market. And so it's really important that they have that. The other issue is the simplification agenda. This is an important agenda that risks going down a wrong direction. Simplification is really important. Some of the regulations and policies that the EU and the European Commission has adopted in the past have been way too burdensome, have been incredibly complex, sometimes contradictory. So simplifying it is really just very no-nonsense approach, and that's important. But I've heard now that the simplification agenda has, for some European commissioners, become a kind of prestige thing. Every commissioner now wants to have its own omnibus. So Commissioner Jurgensen has now said, I want to have an energy omnibus. And others are saying, I want to have a democracy omnibus. And we want everything simplified. Simplification is great, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Sometimes they're putting forth proposals that aren't just simplifying things. They are creating uncertainty for businesses as well. There are a lot of businesses there that need a safe investment environment and that have, prepared the ground and put everything in place to adhere to European regulations. And if then from one day to the next, everything is changed, that creates a lot of uncertainty, and that's not good for the business sentiment. To come to the external part, I think there are risks and opportunities there. First of all, the opportunities. The EU is really moving ahead or trying to move ahead with trade deals with other partners. So by the end of the year, they're hoping to have a trade deal with India, for example. They want to restart the negotiations with Australia on the trade deal as well. They want to deepen trade ties with Canada. But of course, all of these are overshadowed by what's really happening with the US. And as you mentioned, Jörn, the 9 July deadline, that's coming up very, very fast. And I fear there are different voices within the European Council. You have voices from Ireland, Belgium, Slovakia that are saying, let's not retaliate. Let's just, try to strike a deal as quickly as possible, because those are member states that are particularly affected by the US tariffs. And then you have other member states like France that are saying, no, we have to retaliate hard and we have to stick to our guns and we got to negotiate really tough. And so this is a tough spot for the Commission to also to be in. They got to try to make sure to keep everybody on the line. And one of the points that von der Leyen has put forth now, maybe also to put more pressure on Trump and the US, was this idea of, well, we could create a new rules-based trading organization, teaming up with the CPTPP and kind of having an alternative to the WTO without the US. Now, I think that's a little bit far-fetched for the EU, but, fine. They're dealing with Trump here, right? You got to try your luck with different things. But Friedrich Merz, he said, look, let's just strike a deal and let's not fight too hard either. And this was the first EUCO where he was present, and his voice matters on this as well. So I'm hopeful that they can move into a good direction and get a deal done.
Well, thank you so much, Roderick, for giving us a quick readout of how you see the European Council meeting and its main takeaways. That's unfortunately all we have time for, but appreciate your assessment of a really wide range of big geopolitical issues here on the agenda in Brussels. To our viewers, thank you for watching us, and continue to watch out for more Atlantic debrief content from the Atlantic Council Europe Center. Thank you, and see you very soon.